And we are back. All right, I teased a deck tech for my 2019 Old School World Championship deck list alongside my good friend Sam Tang.
Hello, everyone. How's it going?
Some of you may have seen this deck tech, or at least this deck list, a while back when I recorded a version of it for Daniel Chang's Vintage Magic channel, I think back in 2019. It might have been early 2020, I'm not sure, but it was certainly pre-pandemic. I could go into more detail about that, but I'm going to dive straight into the deck itself. So this deck was the culmination of roughly 3 years of research in old school space. I was introduced to the format in early 2017, gradually iterated on it, figured out a bunch of things. For example, I did not initially appreciate how good Mishra's factories were. And it took me about a year and a half to really be convinced that they belonged in the deck. And of course, that was totally the right decision. It just, not only does it give you an easy way to just close out the game, the ability of this land to not only pressure your opponent, but also to serve as a stopgap against early creatures. For those who don't necessarily know this, back in the 1990s, there was a totally different mechanical way that the Mishra's factory was treated. Do you remember what that was, Sam?
I don't remember. Tell us.
So the factory it had all the same rules, right? It's just a land, and you can pay 1 mana to turn it into a 2/2 assembly worker. And factories could, of course, as long as they weren't summoning sick, they could tap to give +1/+1 to another factory worker. But there was a catch. In the 1990s, and probably into the early 2000s also, there was a universal rule in Magic that stated that tapped creatures dealt no damage. So imagine this scenario. Your opponent has a Curd Ape in play, and you have a factory in play. Your opponent attacks you with the Curd Ape. You block with your factory, you make it a 2/2, and then after blockers are assigned, you tap the factory to make it a tapped 3/3. Well, in 1994, you would have been able to successfully stop the Curd Ape, but the Curd Ape would deal 2 damage to the factory and take nothing in return because the factory was tapped. But what if there's 3 Curd Apes in play and you have 1 factory? Well, your opponent sends all 3 Curd Apes in. The Curd Ape is a 2/3. So one of your Curd Apes gets stopped by the factory and the other 2 hit you for 4. And you take 4, and you take 4, and you take 4. And that's not really sustainable. With modern rules, that single factory holds off 3 Curd Apes by itself. Your opponent could attack with all 3, but you will block one of the Curd Apes as a 2/2, tap to make a 3/3, and the 3/3 will deal damage to the Curd Ape and kill it. So you'll take 4, and then you'll take 2, and then you've stabilized, which means your opponent cannot even attack you, even though they've got 3 Curd Apes in play, and all it cost you was a land drop. That is so insane. Imagine if you get 2 factories in play and your opponent has a Juzam in play, a 5/5 black creature for 4 mana. Your opponent attacks you with a Juzam.
You double block, make them both 3/3s. Now you've got 6 on the board.
Exactly. You have 2 factories in play, you double block the
And
Juzam.
the Jin can only kill one of the factories.
And you trade a factory for a Juzam, which means your opponent doesn't attack you anymore, and they just take 1 damage every turn. Even 2 Juzams might not attack you. It's that insane. The card is so unbelievably powerful and oppressive that it's a pretty much automatic 4-of in every single deck in the format. And by any criteria, that merits restriction. Although I believe to date only a single version of Old School has been doing the restricted factory. And it's a way more interesting format for it. I'll talk about that more later, but I want to start with the spells first. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have the perennial favorite, the best removal spell ever printed in the history of Magic from Alpha, Swords to Plowshares, which was actually one of the original reasons why I was attracted to white as a color when I was first learning the game. My friend and I played, and we realized that, yeah, you gave your opponent some life, but it didn't really matter very much at the end of the day. When you're taking 8 to 10 points out of your opponent's life total in the end game, who cares if they gain 6 or 8 or something?
It's a level up moment as a Magic player to really understand the value of letting your opponent gain just a trivial amount of life to take down a lethal board piece that is a permanent on the board, affecting gameplay forever.
And at instant speed.
Correct.
Because in this old format, it was actually really hard to get card advantage.
And for 1 white mana, too.
Yeah, and the fact that your opponent would often invest in their creatures through creature enchantments or pump spells or ritualing out a creature, you pay 1 white mana to remove it, it just felt so backbreaking. Honestly, and this card, and to a lesser extent, the cheap prevalence of counter magic, really discouraged people from playing creatures above 3 mana. Most creature decks that were good that used creatures capped out at around 3 with the Serendipity Free, Hypnotic Specter. And the best creatures of the era were Savannah Lions, Curd Ape, the Order of Leetboard, the Order of the Ebon Hand, Black Knight and White Knight, Lanora Elf, Steer into Befreit, there really weren't too many beyond that. Because if you're going to pay 4 mana for an Urnam Jin or something, or you're going to pay 5 for a Sarah Angel or 6 for a Shivan, what is Lord of the Pit, 7?
Yeah, something like that.
All the big, like, dopey things, Force of Nature 6, they pay 1 white and just kill it.
Right. It's the old school original version of Dies to Doomblade.
Dies to Doomblade, yeah, except Swords to Plowshares is just Doomblade on steroids.
Exactly.
It just kills everything. It kills indestructible stuff. It's so broken.
It's exile. Yeah.
Totally insane. And in a pinch, it also can gain you life.
Correct.
And in some of the games that I played in GP Vegas, at the Old School World Championship, including games that you will see, that part of the card was vital in my ability to stay alive.
That's right.
Sometimes you need to kill your own creatures with it.
Again, it's a masterclass because it was masterfully done.
Thank you. Below Swords to Plowshares, we have Counterspell.
Yep.
Which was the gold standard for counter magic until Legends came along. And I've never really liked Counterspell as an effect, mainly because barring situations where you're saving it for your opponent casting a 2-for-1 or greater, you're only ever interacting 1-for-1 with a Counterspell. That said, the use of counter magic in this format is one of the highest skill testing things in the game. It's nothing that you can just learn intrinsically. You can't even really teach it, because so much of my intuition about using Counterspell is instinct.
It's not just about restraint, it's also about understanding the information that your opponent is willing to give you, because you are playing, in a sense, with imperfect information.
Exactly. And the more that you can pay attention to your opponent and recognize their play patterns, the way that they move cards around in their hand, their body posture, when you're watching your opponent and they have 2 land in play, and they draw a card and you see them wince slightly, and then they pay 2 mana and they cast a Felwar Stone, you counterspell that Felwar Stone a lot of the time, because that wince means that they missed a land drop. And now suddenly Counterspell cuts off a third of their mana. But if you're not looking for that, if you're busy staring at your hand and shuffling your cards compulsively, as so many players do these days, you might miss it. And you might win the game on the spot with that Counterspell because you stopped the Felwar Stone, which prevented them from playing the 3 or the 4 drop for 6 more turns.
Which basically means that if you understand the value of what's going on in the moment, your Counterspell can either cut off whole lines of play for your opponent.
Exactly.
Or you can activate whole lines of play because you've wasted a Counterspell.
Precisely, yeah. And sometimes the ability to bait out counterspells from your opponent by changing the modulation of your voice, the way that you put a permanent into play, how forcefully and aggressively you present it to your opponent. Obviously, I always present cards on the stack rather than putting them directly into play whenever my opponent is representing counter magic. But how vociferously you do that can compel your opponent to either counter or not counter. You announce something really aggressively because you want them to counter it, and a lot of people will take the bait. It's often called Jedi mind tricking. So there's all these little fringe cases where you can utilize Counterspell and leverage skill, but fundamentally the card is usually trading for 1-for-1. And the best use of Counterspell in the deck is to do one of 2 things. It's generally to constrain your opponent's card draw, or the backbreaking spells that your opponent can play, including Mind Twist, Balance, Wheel of Fortune, Time Twister, and Brain Geyser, and of course Ancestral Recall. And it's also to push through your casting of those effects also. So saving a Counterspell, you might have a factory in play and you attack with it. Your opponent goes, bolt it, and you go, throw it in the trash. You don't even care, because using a Counterspell to save a factory is not a good investment. That's a 1-to-1. But later on in the game, when I cast Brain Geyser for 5 and my opponent has a Red Blast, counterspelling that Red Blast turns that Counterspell into a 5-for-1, potentially game-winning. And looking for those situations is key to using this card. That said, it's a very sort of generic effect, and I readily sideboard them out in matches all the time. Whenever I determine that there isn't anything that's particularly backbreaking my opponent might do that I need Counterspell for, I will take them out of my deck.
That's a great tip, because so many people lean on the crutch that is Counterspell, because it's old dependable.
Exactly.
How dare you sideboard it out?
Yeah, it seems crazy, but a lot of my matches I'm taking out 1, 2, sometimes even 3 Counterspells from my deck. Often I'll leave in 1. There probably aren't matches where I'd leave in where I'd take them all out. But against a mono red deck, what is Counterspell good for?
It's actually, bad card advantage.
Yeah, it's horrible. Like, what are you going to stop with it?
Exactly.
Maybe you stop a random Goblin Grenade when you happen to have 2 blue untapped. Not a good card against mono red, not good against a lot of decks. But speaking of good cards, Disenchant.
Oh, yes.
So funny. This card sees almost no play in Commander format, even though it's still very good. And they printed a million different alternate versions of it. There's a card called Fragmentized. Do you know that card?
Yes.
Yeah, 1 white mana. It's basically Disenchant for 1 white, although it's at sorcery speed. Disenchant is instant speed, so particularly useful in a format that's run where Mishra's factories run amok. And it's such an insane, flexible way to kind of just do everything the deck wants to do.
In Magic history, Disenchant is one of those cards you learn first. You learn Disenchant, Giant Growth, Lightning Bolt, Counterspell, like Terror. Disenchant is like one of the core mechanics of the game.
Yep. And it's been improved upon mainly in mana cost, but not in flexibility. They've never made a nature's claim in white, as far as I know. The closest thing is probably Fragmentized. They made a card recently called Portable Hole, which is pretty damn good. It's a 1 white mana artifact, and when it comes into play, it's like an Oblivion Ring. But it affects permanents, I think, with CMC 2 or less.
Okay, yeah.
I believe it's 2 or less. It might be even 3, although I generally use it to kill a narrow range of permanents commander. That card's amazing, honestly. 1 white mana to just exile a 2-drop of any type. It's really insane. So it's arguably better than Disenchant, although it is, of course, as an artifact, it's a sorcery. But Disenchant is incredibly flexible, and it goes right hand in hand with the deck's key strategy, containment. I said for years that the best land destruction deck in old school or Type 1 format was blue-white control. You'd think the deck that had 4 Stone Rain, 4 Sinkhole, 4 Ice Storm, 4 Strip Mines was the best LD deck. The amount of games that you have where you wind up with your opponent having literally no permanents in play when you play the deck correctly, hundreds, thousands of games that I've played, including a game I played recently against you. So those are all the 4-ofs. There's only 3 sets of 4 in the entire version of the deck, outside of the lands. So this is a big departure, this next part right here. I have 3 copies of Jayemdae Tome. And back when I played the deck years and years and years ago in the 90s, I only ran 1 Jayemdae Tome.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and it's the reason is because the format was so slow and so grindy and so attrition-based because a pivotal card was unrestricted in that era. It was the card Mana Drain. And Mana Drain is not just Counterspell, but it's take all the mana from the thing you countered and use it against your opponent to Brain Geyser, or to cast a Jayemdae Tome for free, or a Mirror for free, or to cast Mind Twist for their entire hand, or do crazy sequences where you go Time Walk, Regrowth, Time Walk, Time Twister, and stuff. Mana Drain allowed you to do so many broken things that you had to respect the card so much starting on turn 2 of the game generally, which meant that if you had a bunch of tomes in your deck, they would just accumulate in your hand. What are you going to do? Tap out and play a tome? Or with 6 mana, you're going to play a Jayemdae Tome. And your opponent goes, Mana Drain Jayemdae Tome. Now what do? Do you fight over it? Let your guard down and you're like 12 turns into the game? No, you're going to discard the Jayemdae Tome because you can't tap out. Because they Mana Drain your Tome, and you're like, oh shit, well I got 2 mana untapped. I guess I let the Tome get Mana Drained. And then they untap and they go, strip mine your other one of your 2 mana, and now they got 4 mana to Mind Twist your entire hand of 7 cards when you die on the spot. So running 4 tomes did not make sense in that era. Nowadays, there's only 1 Mana Drain. So the consequences of tapping out to do something in modern old school are a lot less grievous, which means you can play with more Jayemdae Tomes. And I used to run 2 copies of Disrupting Scepter, which was also germane to the fact that that format was so slow and plodding and incremental, and you were basically just grinding out a win over many, many turns. You'd often Time Twister and Feldon's Cane before you finished your opponent off, and Scepter was all part of that plan. Jayemdae Tome didn't really slot into it, but in modern day, in tap-out old school, Jayemdae Tome is the card to play with, and 3 is the right number, I'm pretty sure, at least in Eternal Central. A lot of people have played 4, but I think with 4, you just get 2 of them in your hand too early when there's other things to do, and they're just dead for ages. 3 is about the right number because by the time you get sort of set up and entrenched in the game, you can defend the Tome if you need to. Or your opponent has already used 2 or 3 artifact removal spells on other things, trying to contain you, and then when the Tome comes down, it's indestructible. So I ran with 3, and I think that's the right number. Over here, I have another departure from my old deck list. I'm running 2 copies of The Abyss.
The Abyss is a great card.
Incredibly powerful, 1 black mana to cast, so very, very splashable also. Back in the day, the deck was famous for running 2 copies of Moat. And my early forays into old school also used Moat. I ran 2 copies of Moat and a Shivan Dragon as my sort of air ground defense.
And the Serra Angels and the Shivan Dragons just fly right over the moat.
They fly right over the moat, and so they're perfectly positioned. And back in the day, not nearly as many decks ran Disenchant. So you'd often play Moat and you just kill your opponent on the spot because their whole deck is ground creatures. And they got nothing that flies, and they've got 4 lightning bolts to kill you with.
Right? The Curd Apes.
Yeah, and all you have to do is just protect Moat. Because people were not, in their blue, red, green tempo decks and stuff, they were not running Disenchant. And they didn't really run Tranquility either because it's so bad. So if you played Moat, they just died. And Moat had the added advantage of essentially killing all the ground creatures the turn it came into play. Whereas if you're at 8 and you play the Abyss and your opponent has 3 creatures in play, you still die.
That's right, it doesn't trigger.
It doesn't trigger. And Abyss has a couple of ancillary drawbacks because it's a targeted effect. It requires a player to target one of the creatures they control and destroy it, which means it can't kill pro-black things.
All right, so White Knight, Order of Labor.
Exactly, and also Whirling Dervish, which was played in a lot of deck lists because Bertrand Lestray finished second in 1994 Worlds with a Whirling Dervish deck. And, I mean, I guess he had other creatures too, but Whirling Dervishes were featured in his deck. So a lot of people played Whirling Dervishes back then also, even though it was double green. And it's pro-black, so you can't kill with Abyss. But the main reason is that I finished a lot of the games with 2 Serra Angels. And I can't play an enchantment that kills my own Serras. That doesn't make any sense. But in modern day, when the only creatures in the deck are 4 Mishra's Factories, which are totally unaffected by Abyss, it is way stronger.
Because it also doesn't target artifacts.
Right. It does not affect artifact creatures, although they would never be artifact creatures during upkeep. But it's so much easier to cast, particularly in a format with 4 strip mines in it, where your opponent is often killing your mana early. And getting the double white in time to actually survive the onslaught from the red, white, blue deck that goes turn 1 Lion, turn 2 Order Elite Boar, turn 3 Factory Serendib, when you're running Abyss, it doesn't work. I'm sorry, when you even if you have a Moat, you can play the Moat, they can just disenchant it, they can counterspell it, or they can keep you off of double white. And so the card just seemed unreliable. And then the other final part of it, which is extremely important too, is that if I'm planning on closing the game out with Mishra's Factories, how exactly is that compatible with playing an enchantment that prevents those factories from attacking? Those two things don't work. So Abyss was the right choice. And in fact, one of my reasons to push the deck further into black is the fact that in testing, when I had Volcanic Islands in it, I had a lot of games where I did not have black mana, where I had Volcanic Islands instead, or an early Underground Sea or an early City of Brass was destroyed with Strip Mine, and I couldn't play the Abyss. So I just needed more black. Abyss is king, it's primo. It's the best overall kind of lock the creatures up enchantment spell in the game. We're almost in actually, everything is singletons until the mana from this point onward. I have a single copy of Divine Offering, which I ultimately decided was necessary not just for ancillary life gain, because you can use it on your own Jam-Day Tome in a pinch to gain 4. Sometimes your opponent has Jam-Day Tome, or sometimes they have artifact creatures like Juggernaut or Su-Chi. And being able to Divine Offering and gain life off their stuff is a big deal, particularly against even decks that are running cheaper artifacts like Black Vice and Anka Mishra. Killing an Anka Mishra and gaining 2 life can be decisive. In fact, and I found that I wanted the Divine Offering effect in so many games. I figured out that I wanted Divine Offering all the way back in 2018 and was main decking it back then, which surprised a lot of opponents. I'd cast a Divine Offering in game 1 and they'd be like, what the hell? Why is that in your deck? And I'd be like, I don't know, because you're playing 4 Vices and 4 Anks, dude. It's a good card. And proved decisive in a lot of the games at the Old School World Championships. I have a single copy of Fireball, which is the only red spell in the whole deck. And you notice, if you take a glance over here, I only have 1 purely dedicated red source, a Ruby, but I do have 4 Cities of Brass. I have 3 Felwar Stones, which often piggyback on City of Brass. And I, of course, have Black Lotus. And Fireball is meant to basically be not only an alternate finisher, because I'm not running Time Twister, and if I have to burn Recall early for a reason to get entrenched in the game a little bit more, or to get a critical 4th mana source or something, and I don't have access to Recall, if the factories get strip mined or destroyed, I can wind up having no way to win. So having that Singleton Fireball allows me to win in a game where the factories have been destroyed, or I'm running out of time and I'm in danger of being decked, and I can just do 15 to their face.
Especially because you have enough mana sources.
Yeah, and I've done crazy things where I like cast a Fireball and then I mana drain my own Fireball, and then I Time Walk, and then I Recall and I get back the Fireball and the mana drain, and I Fireball again and mana drain my own Fireball again, and Time Walk again to move the Fireball mana between 3 successive turns to finally Fireball the guy for 40.
That's insane.
Yeah, sometimes you have to do crazy stuff like that.
It's like really shitty old school suspend.
Yeah, it is. It is, exactly. Yeah, it's almost like an echo cost or something, right? You like pay to cost multiple times to Fireball for 40. Yeah. You echo it 2 turns or something. Either way, it allows you to win games and to steal games in a pinch. And it also is important removal against that range of creatures I talked about, the pro-white and pro-black class of creatures, particularly Order Elite and Order of the Ebon Hand, which have 1 toughness. Nothing feels better than like Fireball both your Orders of the Ebon Hand on turn 4 or whatever.
Yeah, it's mega card advantage.
Mega card advantage, and just backbreaking because they're counting on those creatures to go the distance. So the Fireball's excellent. It is, among all the cards you see in front of you, it is the card that gets sideboarded out the most. I 100% take it out against control decks usually, and I take it out against a lot of mid-range decks also. It's too clunky as a removal spell, unless it's against that range of things. And a lot of those decks, you win with inevitability and you don't need the effect. So look to sideboard out Fireball pretty readily, but it's worth having in the deck main. And that actually concludes all of the non-restricted cards in the deck. So I'm going to move relatively quickly through the restricted list since you're all very familiar with this. It's a total of, looks like 10 restricted spells outside of the mana. So the two, I don't know, these are obligatory. Demonic Tutor and Mind Twist, kind of in every deck in Old School, regardless of theme or purpose. There are a few decks probably where you wouldn't run Tutor or Mind Twist if you're running, mono red. But honestly, even in those mono red decks, you should probably splash some Badlands and run Demonic Tutor and Mind Twist anyway. The cards are just too good. Just like splashing a little bit of blue for Ancestral Recall and Time Walk and probably Time Twister. But either way, Demonic Tutor, I mean, it literally says draw the best card in your deck for this situation, right?
It's basically your best card twice.
Yep. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this, actually. It's kind of cool. Take a look at my Mind Twist right here. So this was a recre of a card that I actually illustrated myself in 1994. We had a nickname for Mind Twist, and the nickname was Remove Fun. To the point where we eventually got to a point where we had gentlemen's agreements where we'd take Mind Twist out of our deck and see if we could win without it.
You're technically not removing fun because it is fun itself to cast.
Yeah, to an extent. It certainly sucks to have it cast on you.
Yeah, well, that's their problem, not yours.
Fireball for your opponent's hand. And in fact, there's all of these origin stories about the deck and why the deck was called the deck. And the reason why the deck was called the deck was because my friend and I, who co-built the original primitive version of it, our version had 4 Mana Vaults, 4 Libraries of Alexandria, and 4 Mind Twists in it. And after those 12 cards, you didn't need much else to win games in maybe March to April of 1994 when the game was still in its infancy.
Wow.
And the reason why we called it the deck was because we had built all these other strategies that seemed kind of degenerate. A land destruction deck, the direct damage deck, the protection deck. And then we built this deck that was built around leveraging these 2 insane unrestricted card advantage mechanisms. Library for card draw, Mind Twist for discard. And this thing annihilated everything we threw against it. It beat everything. Nothing could stop it. And so we lacked superlatives to describe it, and we decided to call it the deck. And off it went into history.
Wow, that's incredible.
And yeah, he was my playtest partner for roughly the first 2.5 to 3 months that I played the game intensively, and then he went off to do other things. And then Mind Twist and Library both got restricted, and I had to pivot to options to replace them, and touched on both Jam Day Tome and Disrupting Scepter to replace them. Obviously weaker versions of Mind Twist and Library, but would accomplish the same thing in a long game. But I illustrated Mind Twist myself. I took a revised Mind Twist that had a white border, and I used a pencil eraser, and I erased the original Julie Barrow artwork, the Edward Munch's The Scream or whatever, and replaced it with a skull and crossbones, which was evocative of that feeling when you get Mind Twisted for 6 and you're dead, but you're like the Walking Dead. You're a corpse at this point, a shambling zombie with no cards in your hand, top decking while your opponent double tomes, and you're basically, you're dead.
Yeah.
And so I thought that having a skull and crossbones was really kind of very nice and flavorful, but it always bothered me that the rest of my deck was black bordered. And I had this one random white bordered card in my deck as an outlier with my honestly not great illustration. I think it's okay, but not amazing. And I always thought, one day I'm going to replace this. I just need to wait for the right situation. And that situation presented itself one day when I went down to a place called Crab Jab Studios in Soto, which is south of downtown Seattle. And Crab Jab Studios it's like an art commune or something where a lot of local artists go and exhibit their art and talk and network and make art. And I met Julie Barrow at Crab Jab. If you look right there, Julie Barrow is the artist of Mind Twist. And I chatted with Julie for about an hour and looked at some of her stuff. And actually, I was picking up a card that she had illustrated for a friend of mine who had bought it. A painting, actually an original painting from Legends of Underworld Dreams.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a Julie Barrow original. And Julie and I were chatting, and I told her the story about my altered Mind Twist. And I said, you know what? I have a beta Mind Twist in my collection, Julie. Would you be willing to modify it for me? Would you be willing to do an alter, which are very common in Old School? A lot of people have decks that are filled with alters. Would you be willing to do a recreation of my original art in your style? And she said, absolutely, yes. So we didn't even really agree on a price. I eventually I think I mailed it to her. And a month later, she said, I got it ready. She sent me a picture of it, and it looked fucking awesome, honestly. And then I got it in person, and she only wanted $20 for the altar.
Wow.
But I insisted on giving her $100. And so I paid Julie Barrow $100 for this insane altar. Look at this thing.
Yeah, I mean, like, Julie Barrow altered her own card to do the skull and crossbones from your youth.
She did an altar of my altar.
That's crazy.
Very meta.
Yeah, but still, and it's from the original artist too.
Yeah, so now when I cast this card on people, they get it. Death comes for you. Exactly. And Mind Twist, of course, is like, it's both like the nail and the coffin.
I've literally never survived a game after you've Mind Twisted me. It was basically like, the game's basically over. I'm just solitaring my death.
You feel so demoralized.
Yeah.
Right? All of your plans are just obliterated.
It's like nothing to do.
All your hopes and dreams are in the graveyard, and you're just laid bare. You're flayed.
Yeah. And Modern Jund with Literally Out of the Veil and Inquisition of Kozilek and Thoughtseize is just Mind Twist, but separated out over 7 or 8 turns. Like, that's how weak some of those things are against the original Mind Twist.
Incidentally, though, Mind Twist was banned for years in old school. In fact, I'm often cited and credited as being the reason why it got banned.
You're the reason why we can't have fun, Brian.
Yeah, and the reason I actually wanted it banned had nothing to do with Type 1. It had to do with its effect on Type 2. It was just in every deck in Type 2, and it just counterfeited and ruined so many competitive games. Where you'd be playing a red-white beatdown deck with a Mind Twist in it, and you just draw the Mind Twist and win like on turn 5 or something. And Soul Ring was around for a while in Type 2 also, I think. Mind Twist just did not belong in there. It was a huge outlier, and I was just saying that the card is a crutch. It's really preventing a lot of people from getting better at the game, and it's ruining a lot of the competitive scene, and it should be banned for that reason. And Wizards eventually agreed and got rid of it. So, but what was so cool too was the fact that the game continued to evolve so much that eventually not only were they able to unban Mind Twist, but in modern Vintage, it's unrestricted.
Oh, wow.
You can play 4 Mind Twists again. It's come full circle from 30 years ago.
That's excessive.
And nobody plays Mind Twist.
That's hilarious.
Nobody plays Mind Twist. They just play Thoughtseize.
Wow.
It's just better. Because the format, modern Vintage is so fast that there's no space for an X spell in it anymore. You got to be doing everything on turn 1. It's such a broken, dumb format, really. It's like, the archetypes. Control kind of exists, but it's in a weird space. Control is stacks. It's like the only way you can really control in that format is you make everything cost 1,000,000 mana. It's containment, but not through mana destruction. It's through just creating this oppressive environment around the game where your opponent there's like tangle wire and spheres of resistance and on and on and on. There's that Lodestone Golem. Insane thing that got restricted. They restricted Juggernaut in the format because it was also Sphere of Resistance. And there's millions of hate bears and stuff. And it's basically, there's just no room for an X discard spell anymore. You kind of make their whole hand not matter by just making it so they can't cast anything. But the card was titanic in power level back in the day, and of course is incredibly powerful in old school and is mandatory. Regrowth is the only green card in the deck. A number of people have opted to put Sylvan Library as a second green card. And I think Sylvan is pretty powerful. It's very, very good in the mirror. It combines incredibly well with Ivory Tower as well. But the problem with Sylvan Library is that the format has a dearth of shuffle effects. There aren't that many ways to shuffle in old school. And if you look at this deck, the only way I can shuffle is Demonic Suitor. I'm not even running Time Twister. So often you'll play Sylvan Library and you look at the top of your deck and you're like, oh, that's 3 lands. Awesome. Am I going to pay 8 to go past 2 lands? And then you look at 3 more cards. There's 2 more lands in there or 3 more lands in there. You're going to take another 8 and go down to 4 against a deck that's got 8 bolts and Psy Blasts in it and stuff, or has 2 Black Vices or an Anka Mishra in play against you. It's just, you can't pay the life most of the time. The card is not reliable, and I don't think it's good enough to warrant a green card, which is hard to cast in the first place. So, but Regrowth is amazing. Regrowth allows you to just cycle all the degenerate effects in the deck. Gives you the extra ability to time walk twice. You can Ancestral extra times. You can get back Strip Mines and Chaos Orb and do whatever. You can even double Fireball, triple Fireball, whatever with it. So the flexibility of the card, the fact that it's splashable makes it more than worth it, I think, even though it's green. This card, Balance, was in the sideboard of the deck for a long time, and I ultimately decided that I want it just as a failsafe. It's just a panic button. It's a reset button that allows you to deal with degenerate starts from the opponent, as long as those degenerate starts don't involve a lot of artifacts. And Balance is kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card against heavy discard strategies, which are problematic also, particularly in Game 1. And it's a great equalizer against Library of Alexandria, too. If your opponent libraries and they don't have counter magic, or you're able to force through the Balance, you can often undo 6-7 turns of library with one card. And that alone, I think, makes the card worth it. But I put these 2 cards down side by side because of all the spells in the deck, these are the two that get sideboarded out the most. I don't use balance in a lot of the matches, but you kind of instinctively and intuitively should pay attention to when the card might be good and when to take it out. Then we have, of course, the mighty 5 blue. This is like the power. This is the new power. What would it be? Power 5? Alongside them, there's the famous power 9. But the power 9 should not include Time Twister, objectively. And it should include at least Mana Drain, likely Recall, and of course Soul Ring belongs in there too. So the power 9 needs some revisions. It should be something like the power 11. I guess it's a little less catchy.
It's definitely less catchy.
Power 11. We have to define what that
People
is.
keep asking me, like, you know what the power 9 are? And I always miss one of them. It's like, what are the 8 wonders of the world? Like, I don't know.
You probably forget Time Twister, right?
I always forget Time Twister.
No one thinks, Time Twister is legal in Commander. Let's get real. It's just not that good. I mean, it's a very powerful effect, but it's symmetric and it requires you to sculpt a situation. There's a lot of times when you play Time Twister, when you draw it and you do not want to play it. Playing it would be suicidal, honestly. And I think balance is kind of in that same category too. And I wouldn't want to play with 2 of those effects. And I think that balance is just more likely to get you out of trouble than Time Twister is. Time Twister is kind of like put a lot of permanents in play and then just lock in your advantage on the board by twistering, which is good, but it's inconsistent. That's not really the way you want the games to play out anyway. So for the power 5 in blue, we have, of course, Ancestral Recall, the most powerful card ever printed in the history of the game that's legal.
Yeah, it's really good.
Contract from Below is more powerful, of course. It's 1 black mana to draw 7, but it's an anti-card, so it's banned. And they've actually printed a couple of cards in modern day that I think are more powerful than Ancestral Recall. You'll never guess what they are, Sam, though, because you're not a Commander player.
I wouldn't know at all.
I've talked about this a little bit on my channel. So whenever they print a legendary creature or a legendary permanent that can be your commander, like a planeswalker, it has hidden text on it that you don't see. And that hidden text is the rules of Commander. It says, this card always begins in your opening hand. You cannot be forced to discard this card. If you cast this card and it changes game states, countered, discarded, exiled, whatever happens to it, destroyed from play, instead of going into the graveyard or exile, it goes back into your hand. So it's always in your opening hand. How insane is a card that's always in your opening hand? Because you can build your whole deck around it. And so consequently, there are a few planeswalkers that they printed recently. The most egregious offender I've talked about a lot on this channel, it's called Minsk and Boo.
I've lost to that card a lot.
Right, so insane that it runs roughshod over vintage apparently. And in Commander, it's always in your hand. So it's 4 mana, win the game in Commander. That's what the card literally is. It's that strong. And so you build your whole Commander deck to just cast it on turn 1 or turn 2 because it's always in your hand. So if I had a choice, if I sat down and played a game of Magic against you and we played Commander, I always got Minsk and Boo in my opening hand and you got Ancestral Recall in your opening hand, I would win a sizable majority of games.
That's ridiculous.
Because you'd Ancestral and I'd be like, cool, draw some like lands and some mana. I'm going to play Minsk and Boo on turn 1. Here's a 4/4, bash. Next turn, hit you for 4, draw 4 cards and kill your thing, and I just cast Tidings for 0. And off I go, and it's still in play. Way more powerful than Ancestral, but only when you account for the format and the extra text that's not actually on the card. I had this conversation with Matt Place a while ago, and I think I won him over, actually, in my way of thinking, because he's like, how could a 4-mana thing be better than a 1? Brain Geyser, incredibly powerful, restricted blue spell, the backbone of late-game card advantage in this deck, but you can cast it sometimes for 4 mana, 5 sometimes, to get enough of an advantage to really pull ahead in the game. And it's a finisher in a pinch also. Sometimes you lose all of your all of your finishers. All the factories die, or you lose the fireball, or your opponent's at like 1,000 life for some reason. And you can still win the game with Brain Geyser. And remember I talked to you about how I've done that sequence of Expel, Drain, Regrowth, Expel, Drain, Recall, etc. You can do that with Brain Geyser too, to ramp up a Brain Geyser to 30 or 40 cards if you need to. So it provides that in a pinch. Mostly it's just win the game when you spend 6, 7, 8 mana on it. You just get so far ahead they can't come back. Time Walk doesn't even need an explanation. 2 mana, take an extra turn with no strings attached, like die at the end of the next turn, like Final Fortune or whatever. And this effect is still playable in a lot of formats at 5. So at 2, it's just totally ridiculous.
Oh yeah.
Recall is really interesting. I play it as a 1-of. This card is actually unrestricted in several old school formats. I believe Atlantic rules and Swedish also have unrestricted recall. And I'm not sure what the right number is in there. I think it's probably 1 or 2. But almost under no circumstances should you ever play more than 2 recalls in a deck. I think there's one deck, it might be the Twiddle Time Vault deck, I think, which is a real thing because Time Vault's unrestricted and errated, or unerrated, so that you can get a free turn by just twiddling it. And recall's good in that deck when you have Howling Mine and stuff out, because you just have like infinite time walks. Other than that fringe deck, I don't think you'd ever want to play more than 2, and it's between 1 and 2. And of course, Mana Drain, the most incredibly powerful counterspell ever printed. Format warping. And a lot of people talk about how great Force of Will is. Force of Will is insane. It's the best. Force of Will is basically the best utility counterspell. It's the most useful counterspell. But Mana Drain is the most powerful counterspell. And that's a very important distinction that I like to make. Mana Drain just warps the format. If you're able to Mana Drain a big spell early, you can just win the game instantaneously. And the threat of Mana Drain, often when you Demonic Tutor for Mana Drain, it totally changes how your opponent has to play. I do that in Commander all the time, usually through Merchant Scroll.
Oh yeah, I love Merchant Scroll.
Amazing card, right?
It's totally underrated. People don't play that card enough.
They do not play it enough. I would play it in this deck in a second if I could, but it's not. They haven't printed Homelands yet.
Exactly.
But Merchant Scroll in Commander and a Mana Drain is an emphatic statement. I've got a Mana Drain in my hand. You need to deal with it now. And it totally affects how they play. They may not be able to play their Commander, and so just the very fact you have Mana Drain in your hand prevents them from playing the game. You don't even have to play it. It's just in your hand, and that's enough. And sometimes you have it in your hand in absurd situations. Your opponent taps out to like fireball you for 12, and you Mana Drain it and you untap it, and you're looking at, the Demonic Tutor you've been holding on for 7 or 8 turns waiting for this moment. And you go, I'm going to go get Brain Geyser. Or I'm going to go recall for 6 and bring my entire graveyard back, including multiple turns and the Mind Twist that leveled their hand, ages ago. Card's so freaking insane. So good. And the restriction of this card is the biggest divergence between old school format and what used to be called Type 1, or even before it was Type 1 in just Magic, when we could play with unrestricted Mana Drain. Card is amazing. I totally love it. And even in formats where there's Mana Burn, it's still galactic tier power level. And finally, the last spell in the game, the mighty Chaos Orb.
Oh, I love Chaos Orb.
How good are you at throwing it?
I'm actually pretty good. For someone who doesn't really play old school, I'm pretty decent.
I saw you flipping it, and you actually did have good technique. I use Chaos Orb actually with a technique that's pretty unique to me. I think I'm the only person that does Chaos, that at least that I've seen, that throws it the way that I do. I hold the card, I dangle it vertically in the tips of my fingers. I actually dangle the card vertically. So that,
And you hold it on the long edge.
I hold it on the long edge, exactly. You wouldn't want to hold it from the top. That would be silly. But right. I hold the long edge of the rectangle. So imagine this card rotated 90 degrees. I pinch the edge of it, and I fling it with my finger downward. I give it a little spin with my index finger as I push it off my hand.
Just let it twist downward.
And it does exactly 1 revolution as it falls a foot, because that's the rules. It needs to be a foot above the table.
12 inches, yep.
And it lands generally right directly where my finger pointed at.
Just go straight down.
Yep. And I would say that I'm probably about 97, 98% accurate with it if I had to guess, which means I miss maybe 2 to 3 flips out of 100.
I personally have never seen you miss.
You've never seen me miss?
I've never seen you miss.
When I'm careful, I don't tend to miss. And that was actually incredibly important at Old School World Championships, when in round 5 of the tournament.
When you've got something like Chaos Orb that just destroys whatever you want, you cannot miss.
You can't miss. Yeah.
Like, it's not like you try to disenchant something. They're like, will you miss? Guess a number. You might miss.
The card has weird tension too, because it's not 100% guaranteed.
Exactly.
So the question is let's say I'm at 2, and I'm at 2, and my opponent has a Mishra's Factory in play. Well, I've got a Chaos Orb in play, and I've got a Strip Mine. But do I Strip Mine his other land? Do I Strip Mine his library? And then count on the fact that I'm not going to miss with the Chaos Orb when my life is on the line?
It's like a free throw.
Yeah. Sometimes you do miss.
No, of course.
In round 5 of the tournament, I play against Joel Mick. Joel Mick is a very prominent figure in the old school community, mainly in the secondary market. But Joel Mick, before he was involved in the secondary market, was on Richard Garfield's initial test team.
Wow.
He was one of the original testers of the game. He's in the alpha manual. And Joel Mick was playing in the Old School World Championships, and he and I played in round 5. And he got not even a particularly great draw, but I had one of those really weird fluky draws where my opponent had a turn 1 threat and I had no way to kill it. And in fact, it was an artifact creature. He cast turn 1 Su Chi. And I had none of these. I had no swords, no disenchants, no divine offering, no Chaos Orb, no Demonic Tutor, no Ancestral. I had all the things that didn't kill a turn 1 Su Chi. And I died to it.
Oh, wow.
And I beat him in game 2 because my deck was heavily favored, particularly after sideboarding. And and that's even though I took the Dust to Dust out and I had the second CRP red, which didn't help me against Joel, it didn't matter. I beat him pretty handily, but the game took a long time. And we ran out of time in the third game. And in old school events like this one, if you run out of time, you actually have to decide the tiebreaker with Chaos Orb flips. A flip off. So we got to work, and Joel had a pretty good technique that was slightly flawed. He would drop the card at an angle and have it bounce off his other finger to make it turn.
Interesting.
And it worked pretty well, but it was slightly flawed. And I had my technique, which is slightly flawed also, but I think slightly less flawed. And we went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and we went on for 15 minutes.
Wow.
20 plus flips each with eventually a huge audience.
Wow.
And the judge was standing there, and they were actually talking about the possibility of us doing something else or making us go higher up.
Wow.
And I did not want to lose. But the pressure eventually got to Joel, and the slight variance in his technique eventually cost him the win.
Wow.
It bounced off his finger, did not make a complete revolution, and caught an edge and fell the other way.
Oh, no.
And it missed his target, and I won the match.
Wow.
So I consider myself a very good Chaos Flipper, but not the best. There are a few other people out there, and they know who they are. One of the guys' names is Matt, who literally has a merit badge. He has a merit badge that he wears on his old school. He wears like a Boy Scout uniform for old school from, I think he's part of the Eternal Central group from the East Coast. And he and I played at NoobCon, and we were already basically eliminated, particularly if we got another draw. So when our match was about to go to a draw and they didn't have Chaos Orb flips at NoobCon, you basically just get an actual draw, which would have eliminated us both from top 8. And I suggested to Matt that we do a Chaos Orb flip off anyway. And he perks up and he goes, okay. And at this point, I had no idea who he was, and I had no idea what he was wearing.
You're like, nice flair, dude.
Yeah, he had this weird Boy Scout. It looked like a Boy Scout uniform with all these merit badges all over it. And so we start flipping, and I'm doing my technique, and it's accurate. And he's like a Chaos Orb bot.
Wow.
Chaos Orb literally falling in exactly the same place every time, because Matt uses the best technique, which is simply using gravity.
Wow.
You balance the card at about maybe a 20-degree angle between your index finger and your thumb, and you just let it go. And as it's rotating off your finger, you lift it.
Just slightly.
And it makes one revolution and falls directly straight down.
Just a lift on the counter edge.
He was so good that he could just have you could have superimposed every flip on top of itself and done time lapse, and it would have been 100 Chaos Orbs all sitting in exactly the same. It was that accurate.
Wow.
And we're going back and forth and back and forth. And after about 15, 20 flips in, I look at him and I said, "You're not going to miss, are you?" And he points at the merit badge on his Boy Scout uniform, and he says, "I got this merit badge for hitting 50 in a row."
Wow.
It's a special merit badge that you get for 50 Chaos Orb flips in a row. And what I did was, for a whole month, I woke up every morning and I flipped 50 Chaos Orbs, and I recorded on a spreadsheet how many I hit and how many I missed. And I kept practicing until I hit 50 in a row, multiple days in a row.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, I'm not going to win this.
Well, you got to get you a merit badge.
Yeah, I could probably do 50 in a row if I was really careful. I just didn't even care enough at that point. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to be a little more sloppy. And I eventually missed, and that was the end of the match, and I lost. But Chaos Orb is an incredibly definitive card. It's one of the most powerful removal spells ever printed. But it is effectively errated in old school. The card, based on its original design, was it destroys whatever it lands on.
Right.
Because I think people would just throw it up in the air.
Oh, right,
and
exactly.
it might catch a gust of wind and land in your lap. It might land on your battlefield.
Yeah.
And hit 5 of your lands all stacked up. Or you might land perfectly right where your opponent's cards are, and you might destroy half their battlefield for 3 mana.
Wow.
Pretty grotesque and insanely powerful. And people realized that it caused people to play in a weird way. They had to spread their permanents all over the place. So you'd walk up and you'd see these battlefields where people had stuff perched on chairs and stuff around them to avoid the Chaos Orb. And eventually the old school community, or the Type 1 community, got tired of that and eventually said, okay, well, we're going to errata it so that when you activate the Chaos Orb, you tell your opponent, I'm activating the orb, do you wish to respond? At which point, if let's say they have a JMD Tome in play, they would have to tap the JMD Tome in advance in response to activation. Once you actually declare the target of the Chaos Orb and you go to flip it, your opponent has lost the ability to respond, which is important.
It's kind of like in the modern Magic saying choose a permanent.
Choose, exactly. That's exactly how it works. So it's choose a permanent in play, and then you flip the Chaos Orb to specifically target that.
Right.
The orb has to turn over, and it has to be touching it, and the rules basically say that the sleeves have to be intersecting and stuff. It's pretty straightforward. But the card is it's so universally powerful, and it's kind of like a catch-all. It hits everything. So, your opponent might have turn 1 Blood Moon against you, and you got all dual lands, but you got a Chaos Orb in your deck.
That's right.
So you're saying there's a chance. And sometimes you do have it. And being able to understand when to use Chaos Orb, what I like to do is I like to leave it in play. I generally just leave it in play unless there's an imperative to play it right away. So I'll play the Chaos Orb and I just leave it out there and I make them think about it. Because it does affect how you prioritize permanents, just like how playing into a Nivenrel's Disc does that too. When your opponent has a Nivenrel's Disc sitting in play, or an Oblivion Stone, you're like, how much can I commit to the battlefield here without feeling terrible when he sets it off? And the Orb is kind of like that also. And then there's one other really important thing about Chaos Orb that is unique in Magic, but only in Old School. It is the only artifact in Magic, in this case it's a mono artifact, so you have to tap it to use it, that you can stop the effect. You can stifle its effect with a Disenchant. Every other artifact basically requires, once you activate it, disenchanting the artifact won't do anything.
Correct, because the effect is already on the stack.
Except for Chaos Orb, because Chaos Orb has a ruling that basically says that the orb must be on the battlefield on resolution.
On resolution. So
if you disenchant it, it vaporizes into dust, and the ashes rain down on the battlefield, and nothing is destroyed.
Because you don't end up flipping, and it's gone.
Yeah, so this came up a bunch when I played 7-point Old School Singleton, and I was using my Chaos Orb to play around my opponent's possible disenchant. And the commentators didn't understand why I was doing it. They didn't realize that I was taking into account the fact that he didn't have enough mana available to disenchant it at that time, and that's why I used it right away. Because I could not afford him having a disenchant and killing it. And they didn't pick up on that until I did commentary later on. But those are all the spells, and if you count, it's actually only 29 spells. Do you think that's insane?
I mean, as a control deck, that's a lot of mana sources.
A lot of mana sources, 31 of 60. The deck is more than half mana.
Wow.
Like our commander decks tend to run very few lands, but if you actually count the number of mana sources, they tend to be 45 to 50 in terms of cards that directly produce mana, so it's actually not that different. And this was another huge revelation in the early days of the game, was understanding that you should be playing close to 50% mana when everybody thought you played a third. A lot of 60-card decks with 20 lands, 20 mana sources.
I remember those early 20-40 splits when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And no wonder I sucked and lost because I was mana screwed constantly.
Mana screwed constantly, and people play 20 lands in decks with 5 and 6 and 7 drops and X spells and stuff. It's crazy.
And the solution back in the day was to play 21 mana sources.
Exactly.
Like that fixed anything, right?
Now you tend to play 21 mana sources and then a bunch of mana artifacts. 21 is actually usually the right amount of lands because it's usually 4 sets of 5 and the library and then artifact mana. And depending on what format you're playing, in Eternal Central rules, because you not only have to contend with opposing strip mines, but you're also playing with them. So you kind of start -2 to 3 lands anyway. You want to go all the way up to 31. In formats where strip mine is restricted, you can get away with 28 in control decks. 28 to 29 is about right. You don't want to play 31, that's too many. You just don't need it. Because your mana base is just so much more stable and robust. So speaking of mana base, I'm going to move to the lands. 4 Underground Sea, 4 Tundra. That provides the backbone of the alpha, revised, beta dual lands in the deck. When I played this deck back in the day, I only ran 2 Underground Sea, 2 Volcanic Islands, and 4 Tundras. I actually had to acquire 2 more beta Underground Seas after I had this deck list finalized, which was late 2018. At least the mana base was finalized when I decided I was going to play Heavy Esper and remove Volcanic Islands. You also have 4 Cities of Brass, which actually probably seems like a lot. And I would say in an average game of playing the deck, you probably take 4 to 5 damage from City of Brass. Some games you take like 12, 13 when you get unlucky and you draw 3 of them early and they're your only sources of mana. But the card's flexibility, particularly in a 4 strip mine format, massively overrides the drawback. It used to be a lot less deleterious, of course, when you had Mirror Universe. And not only would you ignore the damage you took from City, but you literally killed your opponent with the City of Brass at the end. It was part of the finishing combo. But 4 Cities of Brass still seems right to me, and every time I've had people take my deck list and remove cities from it, their decks have always performed worse. So even though you have to take damage, it's worth it. The City of Brass is just too good for the flexibility. There's the 4 strip mines, which I've talked about at length. I'm not going to go into a long discourse and treatise about how how to use strip mines. That might be a video for another day because I could do a whole hour-long video about how to use strip mine. And finally, we've got 4 copies of Winter Mishra's Factory.
Winter Mishra's Factory.
Yeah, which are the closers in the deck. And because they're closers, do not attack with factories early. Don't be tempted to do it. A lot of people start doing this. They start attacking with factories early, and they generally pay a heavy price for it. You do not want to turn your opponent's lightning bolts into stone rains. You don't want to turn their disenchants and swords to plowshares into stone rains if you can avoid it. You need these guys later, and sending in the factories for early chip damage is inconsequential. You will win the game inevitably in the long run. You will regret it if you throw 2 factories into the fire when you didn't need to do it. Because you still got your opponent's strip mines to deal with. You just might not have any factories left to win with. And that can be very, very problematic. So be disciplined. Do not attack with factories until it's entirely clear that either you don't mind your opponent killing them or you're ready to deliver the final death blows. Use them just for colorless mana and to block against the decks that are aggressive, and do not attack with them. Generally, that level of discipline is extremely important. The final land in the deck is the vaunted and dreaded Library of Alexandria, a card that I have way more of a hate relationship with than a like relationship.
That's so funny because I've seen you just single-handedly win games with Library.
I've won more than my fair share of games with it, not only because I know how to leverage the card, and I'm very, very careful with how I use the cadence of it. A lot of people will make a mistake and draw on their turn with Library. That's almost always incorrect to do that. Generally, you want to end your turn with 7 and pass the turn back and draw on your opponent's turn with Library when something enters the stack. That's the correct time to use Library. There are sometimes reasons to draw on your turn, but it's usually incorrect because you're often reacting on your opponent's turn. And if you go draw up to 8 with Library, play a Mox or something or a land, pass it back. What if you need to react to 2 things on your opponent's next turn? They cast a Ball Lightning. You Plowshare it. Now you're at 6. Then they cast Wheel. And you go, shit. Counterspell the Wheel, I guess? Now I'm at 5. I untap. I'm at 6. Go back. They cast another thing you need to counter. Now you're at 5. Now you've missed 2 draws, and it keeps going. And I've had so many opponents over the years, literally thousands, do exactly that. Draw on their turn, play in the turn at 7, and I'm able to get 2 cards out of their hand, and they never get back to the library again. So you can avoid that by being disciplined. You generally don't need the 8th card on your turn. Unless there's an emergency, unless you need to hit a land drop, or you're desperately searching for a removal spell or a counter spell or something because you think you're going to die, be disciplined and wait till your opponent's turn.
Just wait, because if you wait, it's an automatic 2 draw.
Yeah.
You just wait.
It's so demoralizing. You can do really, honestly, vicious things to your opponent. When I play, I keep my hand face down on the table most of the time when it's my opponent's turn, unless I need to reference my hand. And so I know what all the cards are. And so you can do things like your opponent casts a spell and you go, hang on, I'm going to tap the library in response. And you draw the card and you put it into the pile, or you move it around, and then you reveal it as if you had just drawn it, when in fact it was the mana drain that was sitting in your hand from the beginning of the game. But they don't know that because you did a little sleight of hand. They're like, oh God, you drew the mana drain off the library. You're so lucky. And all the wind is out of their sails at that point. It's so gutting to have that happen. So look for opportunities where you can use library in that manner. Protect the card, and a lot of the time it's incorrect to play Library of Alexandria on turn 1, even when you draw it. Pay attention to your opponent. Look at their body language. Are they the kind of person that likes to play strip mines early and strip aggressively, or do they tend to be restrained with them and wait and calculating?
They would be very happy to just strip that away.
Yeah. People will generally kill the library on turn 1. They know that, but a lot of players are impulsive with strip mines early. They like them. They like to just strip mine early. It makes them feel powerful, like they're getting agency in the game. And so read your opponent and figure out, are they the kind of person that seems like they might want to strip mine you? Do they have a lot of tattoos? Tattoos are they're a little bit they're emblematic of a certain ethos in Magic players. It's something I picked up on years ago when I used to play all over California and stuff. And I played a lot of games for ante. Not like ante out of the deck, but wagered ante. It was a way that I supported myself before the Pro Tour existed. And I would kind of do psychographic gut checks on my opponent and try to get a read on them, like what kind of a person are they? Are they the kind of person that would be disciplined and reasoned and quiet, and they'd likely hold on to strip mines? Or do they want to just grind the elbow in and strip mine you at the beginning of the game aggressively twice in a row? If you could, the correlation between guys with lots of tattoos and guys that did that was extremely high. So if the dude looked like he might have tattoos or I could see them, I tended to hold the library and let him strip mine me early, and then I would play it on turn 3 or turn 4, and the game would be over. Because he's got 2 strip mines in the graveyard, and the next one's 30 cards down.
Yeah.
And there's no way he's going to be able to. No way he's going to be able to keep up with me.
You know, the way that you value library is all about: are you playing their game or are they playing your game? Because, you know, there's so many other threats in the deck that you have to be focused on really where card advantage lies.
Yeah, exactly. And another strategy, which you'll actually see in at least one of the games that Sam and I are going to do commentary on, another strategy is that the library gives you the ability, in a game that's become very attrition-based, very grindy, 2 control decks that are just playing land and staring at each other with 7 cards in hand, or with some number of cards in hand above, 2 or something, where you got a presence and you can threaten counter magic and mind twist and brain geyser and all the things that you worry about when you play a spell you worry your opponent might have or might counter. You can use the library to break the stalemate. You can use the library to break the stalemate because they can't counter it. And if they use strip mines early, you play the library. Now it's 5-alarm fire for them. Now they actually have to be aggressive. They have to tap out or tap low to play a tome or something to try to keep parity. Maybe they have to go and cast Recall to get a strip mine back from the graveyard, and it gives you an opening to play a lethal Mind Twist. I wonder if that's a little prophetic. Anyway, always be on the lookout for that. And of course, I've talked at length about how much I hate the Library of Alexandria because there's a whole cross-section of players who play old school who I will literally never lose to if they don't have Library of Alexandria. Daniel Chang is among them. I don't think Daniel Chang has ever beaten me in a mirror match of old school without library. It's literally the only way he's ever won. When I played Stephen Menendian in our match, game 1 with his ATOG deck, he got library and he beat me. He didn't get library in games 2 and 3, and I crushed him. And that sort of seems to be a pattern throughout old school. So I would say that in this format, at least in control mirrors, a huge percentage of my games are lost to this card, which is part of the reason why I kind of hate it. But of course, I'm happy to win a game on the back of it too, particularly in a tournament. And then we've got just the Power 7 or whatever you want to call them. 5 Moxes, Lotus, and Soul Ring. And I am, of course, only running 1 red and 1 green spell in here to support with the green, with the Emerald and the Ruby. But they're just so universally good. You can tell, when people draft Vintage and stuff, they always pick Moxes above just about everything. So Moxes are just universally insane. They just let you do all the crazy stuff faster, even if they're essentially colorless.
Right.
So 31 mana sources in total, a lot of colorless lands. Oh yeah, and I left out Felwarstone, of course. Yeah. Felwarstone actually is worthy of discussion because I am not a huge one-size-fits-all advocate for Felwarstone in every version of control decks in this format. I do not run them outside of EC rules, actually. I prefer to run basic lands and things that are more reliable in terms of the color production. So when I build this deck for both Swedish rules and for Atlantic, and I guess there's Pacific too, all the formats where strip mine is restricted, I up the black count in the deck substantially. I bring in usually 3 scrub lands, 2 to 3 scrub lands, and I include copies of Sinkhole instead of strip mines. So I don't run, I remove 3 strip mines, and I remove Felwarstones. And I bring in some basic land, and I bring in scrub lands, and I run Sinkholes in place of the strip mines. So at least I've got some game against library and against all the factories that run amok in those formats too, because you don't have strip mines to contain them. And that change makes the deck really hang well in formats where the library exists and you only have 1 strip mine to combat it. It's enough usually to get through there. Felwarstone is excellent in a 4 strip mine format because it gives you the ability to develop your board while you are strip mining and while you're being strip mined. You can still get mana onto the board, which is so important to getting position in that early game. But the thing is that Felwarstone is not really a ramp card. It's a ramp card in Commander, but in Old School, it's not a ramp card because what exactly is this deck ramping into? I mean, take a look at it. Sam, I mean, what would you ramp into?
You really, I don't know, maybe Abyss.
Ramp into Abyss,
maybe
right?
Abyss, maybe Jam Day Tome, but really you're not even trying to race for Tome because it's very not strategic to Tome early.
The only card you really might ramp into is Balance.
Yeah.
It's really going to be devastating. That you would be fine casting.
Yeah, like you're way behind and you got to balance.
Because let's say you play against a control deck, right? You go land, Felwar. Next turn, land, Felwar. Next turn, what do? Land Brain Geyser? No fucking way.
Yeah.
They're just going to counterspell it or something, right?
Exactly.
So you're just going to wait and wait and wait, and eventually you've just got these things that are worse than lands that your opponent can disenchant.
Correct.
Your opponent can start killing your Felwarstones, and if you're relying on them for mana, it doesn't work out. But when you're going in that early game, it's like this. The game has this famine period at the start where you're just strip mining each other's colored mana, and all you've got is janky colorless lands. And yeah, the Felwarstone doesn't work when it's just janky colorless lands, but it allows you to get more mana on the board in that period. And then when you eventually, get your Tundra, and your opponent has their 1 dual land sitting there, Now you've got 2 blue again because you had the Felwar, even though you're getting strip mine. Plus, it gives you the ability to splash in some odd colors and stuff like that. But I sideboard these out all the time. Against mono red, they're utter trash.
Yeah, exactly. They don't help you at all.
They don't do anything.
It's like they're like mountains by default.
Exactly. and a card that you're going to be pulling out in a lot of matches does not belong in the main deck when you have better options. And when you have better options when you only have 1 strip mine. And it gets really interesting in the 1 strip mine, 1 factory formats. And you got 6. You have 6 of these and the Felwars to contend with. And it makes the mana base really different, and you can play with a lot more variety of cards and stuff. So that is the core deck. 60 cards in the main deck, and I'm going to move to the sideboard starting from right to left.
All right.
1 copy of Ivory Tower. This card was moved from the main deck into the sideboard. I just found that it wasn't good enough in enough of the matchups to warrant inclusion. And I have nothing to spend the life on main deck. I don't have a Sylvan Library. I don't have a copy of Greed. And I just drew this card too many times and it literally did nothing.
It's like a win more card, but it doesn't necessarily impact immediately or help you get back into tempo.
I liked having it because it's such a powerful source of life gain against the decks where you really want the life gain.
Yeah.
But I realized that Divine Offering did kind of the same thing because often these games come down to just 2 to 3 incidental life points. You don't need the high horsepower of the library in some of those games. And the Divine Offering was just so much better and could still gain 4 in a pinch. Sometimes you regrow it and you gain another 4. And Tower was just not good enough. But against the decks that Tower is good against, Blue-Red Burn, Mono-Red, it is insane if you get it early. You just completely wreck their whole game plan. If they can't kill the Tower, they cannot beat you.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's just no way to overcome it. They can like commit all of their attacks every turn to you, and you're just like, whatever, I take 1 this turn. Over and over and over again. By the end of the game, you've taken like 30 damage that you didn't even care about.
Exactly.
It also offsets Black Vice too.
Yeah.
Although the stacking order matters with modern templating because you can die. If you stack them in the wrong order, the Vice will kill you before the Tower heals you.
Correct.
So you have to be careful about that. But you can also do cool things too, like if you have a Jam Tome or a Library in play, let's say you have 7 cards in hand during upkeep, you go stack, resolve the Black Vice, take 3, tap Library, draw a card, resolve Ivory Tower, gain 4, and still gain 1 because of the way. You couldn't do that back in the day, of course. 2 copies of Divine Offering. And again, I had a 3rd artifact removal spell here, the Dust to Dust, which among the 3 artifact kill spells seemed like the weakest. And I wasn't convinced that I wanted 4 Divine Offering back then. My modern version has access to 4. It's the one change that I've made since this tournament took place. I replaced the 2nd COP Red with a 3rd Divine Offering because the card is just so incredibly impactful and powerful. And even though Dust to Dust is insanely strong in the matches where you really want it, casting white against those aggressive ATOG decks and against the Goblin decks that are running Blood Moon and tons of early artifacts and strip mines, very dubious. And you feel great when you get 2 for 1, but sometimes you're like dusting your own Felwar Stone to get rid of their Anka Mishra. That happens more often than you think. And even though a 2 for 1 feels great, you don't need it.
Especially in a format where, remember, listener, like life matters. Like this is old school. Like every point of life matters.
It does.
So it's not incidental that, you're gaining life.
Games can be won or lost literally by 1 life point. And that happened to me multiple times in the tournament. And I'm just kind of used to it, honestly. Because one of the primary revelations that I uncovered and explained to the world when it was honestly unknown was that your life total is a resource. Just like your mana, just like your cards in hand. Your life total is also a resource. And you pay life to gain card advantage. When your opponent bolts you or chain lightnings you, you've paid 3 life to get up 1 card. And the cost of a card, the value of a card in Magic is right around 4 life per card. It's something I've said always. So when a Jam Tome taps to draw a card, it's actually dealing 4 to you. And if your opponent manages to tap Jam Tome 5 times, you've probably lost. You've taken 20, you just didn't realize it yet.
Yeah, and Magic players all understand this concept of the clock. How many turns left do you have? And so, it's definitely a level up moment when you say to yourself, yeah, I'm willing to take that damage because I want to draw another card. And then, if you win at 1, the 19 life didn't matter.
Right, it didn't matter.
Winning at 20 and winning at 1, it doesn't matter at all.
The only time when it really matters when your life total gets constrained, and this will come up in one of the matches in the top 8 as well, is that the lower life total you get, the more extra cards in your opponent's hand start to matter.
Right. They have more outs.
They have more outs, exactly. Because if you're at 9 and they have 3 cards in hand, you don't really have to worry unless all 3 of those cards are lightning bolts. So you can actually use a counterspell on something more innocuous because you're unlikely to die. If you're at 2 and they have 3 cards in their hand,
it matters.
You're not going to counter anything that doesn't kill you.
Exactly. Every every spell matters.
Exactly. So it changes. Your life total does matter in that regard. That said, you can use and leverage your life total to knock multiple cards out of your opponent's hand.
And if you're at 1, all of your City of Brasses turn off.
Yeah, that's true. You can land destroy yourself if you get down to 1. But the point is that once you understand that the life total is another thing to be expended in a context of Magic, it's like you have this whole extra wealth, this wellspring of resources and agency in the game to draw from. And if your opponent doesn't understand that, if they're protecting their life total when they don't need to, when they're casting a Swords to Plowshares to kill a factory when they're at 20, and you've got 11 lands in play or something, that kind of thing, you can leverage that kind of advantage in your opponent's lack of understanding about the value of life points to a win very, very easily.
That situational awareness changes the values of the cards, which changes the lines, which changes card advantage. So, knowing how to value cards based on what the situation is and how much life you have, and also how many turns you have left, and also what you're drawing for, like what outs are you playing towards? All of that matters.
Yeah, all of that matters, and you give yourself more time to accomplish it. All right, moving on. There's a single copy of Wrath of God.
I actually want to hear about this because I have actually not seen you cast this in the sideboard, and I have also not heard you talk about it very much.
I believe I played Wrath of God one time in the tournament. It was against Joel Mick. And I boarded it in several matches, though, because Wrath of God is a card that your opponents generally don't see coming. They generally don't expect it. So there's no Abyss in play, or they're expecting Abyss to come down, which means they want to load the board up with more creatures. So Wrath of God is in the deck against decks like Mono Black, where they tend to just try to put a million black creatures in play and hope you don't draw Balance. It's super, super good against artifact decks that run tons of copy artifacts and Suchi and Juggernaut and Triskelions, and they're just trying to kind of critical mass the board. They barely do anything but just slam threats off of workshops. And so sometimes you can catch 3 for 1 with a Wrath of God. And it's a catch-all against all the protection creatures and so on. And it's an instantaneous effect, unlike Abyss. So there's a range of decks that I think Wrath of God is excellent against. That said, it's super narrow and bad against lots of matchups too. But I just like having that effect in my deck. Just a single copy that I can sometimes demonic tutor for and get 4 or 5 for 1 when my opponent would never expect it.
And what I love about Wrath of God is that it's, the quintessential board wipe. It's like the quintessential reset. It functions in a lot of the same ways as almost a Balance or a Wheel of Fortune would function. And also in Modern, instead of Wrath of God, we have Damnation. Damnation is literally just a color-shifted version of Wrath of God.
Yep.
And then when you're playing Modern Jund and then you slam that Damnation, it is incredibly useful. It is incredible.
They never expect it.
Well, it's not even so much if they expect it, but it's like sometimes I play Modern Jund to get to the point where I race to 4 mana to cast it.
Interesting.
If I can cast it, it's already done its job.
Interesting. Just because the games are so fast and aggressive.
Exactly. Like 4 is a lot.
So much disruption. I know it's a very different format, almost more akin to Vintage.
Yeah.
Than it is to anything like Old School. I just like having it as a panic button.
Oh, I love that.
And a panic button, because the thing is Balance kind of serves this role too, except for the fact that if your opponent plays a couple of Moxes and they bolt you twice and then they have 4 creatures in play, you're going to lose if you cast Balance. Sure, you're going to kill the 4 creatures. You're also going to Mind Twist yourself for 4 and destroy 3 of your lands. You're not coming back from that position. That's the classic play not to lose play.
Right, versus play to win.
Wrath of God is a play to win play, where you punish them for overextending because they don't expect it. I have 4 copies of Blue Elemental Blast. This is a huge departure from the way the deck was played back in the day. I never played Blue Elemental Blast. I played Red Elemental Blast back then because the decks of the time, the really good decks, for a lot of different reasons, but mainly because Mana Drain was a 4 of, ran lots of blue spells, and red decks were not winning anything. They just were not a threat. But in this version of the format, Mono Red is one of the best decks, particularly in a wide open field where a lot of people might be playing Type 1, they might be playing Old School for the first time because their friend handed them a cheap deck to play. Like, oh, cool, I'll play Mono Red. Sure, I mean, anyone can play a Goblin, right? Play a Goblin and a Vice and a Bolt and so on, right? And those decks can just run you over. They can just get a good draw and have you dead on turn 5 when you just draw Tome and Disenchant. Abyss is way too slow. Blue Elemental Blast, so good. And it kills Blood Moon. kills Blood Moon off of the Sapphire. If I just have a single blue mana untapped, I can deal with Blood Moon. It fights counter wars against Red Elemental Blast that those decks sideboard in. It's so insanely good. And I found that it was good in a lot of the weakest matchups that this deck had. I think I started with maybe 2 or 3 of them and eventually went, 4 is correct. And against the decks where you want Blue Blast, you want 8 of them, not 4. So it's an awesome 4-up. And now I'm going to move to, actually, I guess I'll talk about Circle Protection Red. I already told the story earlier in the other video about why I wound up with 2 of them in the deck. And it was a last-minute judgment call. Literally an audible that morning. And I was able to borrow a COP Red from this guy named Jeremy. And so I had 2 of them in the deck. And the thing that was so interesting was, and I don't remember if I touched on this before, but in round 4 when I played against Athena, I beat her in game 1, and I brought in 4 Blue Elemental Blasts, 2 Divine Offerings, Ivory Tower, and 2 COP Red, and just annihilated her with just the main key parts of the deck. And I did the sideboard I talked about. I removed 3 Flower Stone. I removed most of the counterspells. I think I removed 1 Jam Day Tome, and I definitely removed Balance. Balance is horrible against mono red, like utterly useless. And I was able to bring in all these cards against her, and I routed her in the second game. It was never even close. I just sort of was able to surgically dismantle everything that she did. When I finally drew the 2 COP Red, the game was totally over and decisive. And to me, that was an emphatic statement that when I was going to publish the deck list later, I did not want it to include 2 COP Red. I only needed 1 COP Red because that was correct. 2 was excessive. I might not even need 1 based on just the way that the deck had performed against it, because Blue E-Blast is so good. It's just so good against mono red. So this version of the deck has 2. My modern version of this deck, which is almost identical, is -1 COP Red, +1 Divine Offering. But for all intents and purposes now, for the games that we're going to be doing coverage on, this was the build that I had, and I still had these 2 COP Red in the sideboard, as much as I did not like them there. And then finally, the really cool quintessential anti-control components. First of all, a copy of Greed. Greed in a control deck, right? How insane.
This I want to hear. I really want to hear about this.
This card is so underplayed, but I have a lot of black sources, and most importantly, the Greed is in the deck for one specific matchup. It's for the Mirror. And in the Mirror, every deck is running 4 Cities of Brass, and anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 Underground Seas as well. They're all running usually 8 black-producing lands, and I have 3 Felwar Stones. So I've got, between the Jet, and the Lotus wouldn't really count, but this is 8, 11, I have 12 sources of black in the deck whenever I play against a control deck. Casting Greed with 12 sources of black is easy as hell, plus I'm taking Abyss out against them anyway. So swapping the Abyss cost for the Abyss cost is fine. And if you play Greed, it's 1 black mana to draw. Think how insane that is. Who cares about the life? You pay 12, 14 life against another control deck, the game is over. They're never going to be able to beat you when you just draw 6 extra cards for almost no cost. It's so insanely backbreaking, and people tend to load up on Divine Offering and Dust to Dust in the Mirror. They don't run extra Disenchants because they're all running 4 anyway. And it's not like they have the luxury of saving the Disenchant that would kill the Greed for... They can't hold it when you play Tomes and when you play Chaos Orb and various other things. So they often have very few Disenchants left, and Greed comes down, they can't kill it, and you're at 20. Or maybe you're at 24 because they killed 2 factories or something. And you're like, GG, dude. At the end of your turn, draw 3, untap. Okay, I'm at 16. To kill a bunch of your shit. End of your turn, draw 3 more, draw 3 more. And I've taken 18 damage. Who cares? I'm still at 6. And you have no cards in your hand, and you're done. Greed is insanely powerful. And it makes a really, really good sort of 4th card advantage component in the deck to just leverage against the control decks in the Mirror.
As a card drawing engine, earlier you were talking about having Sylvan Library. And instead, you were like, no, Regrowth is the play here. How does Greed compare to Library?
You mean to Sylvan Library?
Exactly.
Yeah, well, Sylvan Library has the advantage that the card draw is half the cost. It only costs 2 to deploy it instead of 4. But the thing is, the Sylvan has this problem with it where the castability is a problem. It's green. And a lot of the time, this deck does not have access to green in the early part of the game. And you really kind of want Sylvan early. That's when it's really powerful. By mid-game, you've already taken a lot of damage off City of Brass. You might have been hit by factories 5, 6 times while you kind of developed and you didn't care. And so you might draw the Sylvan by mid-game, or you might cast it in mid-game, and the 4 life loss is just catastrophic. Greed you can still use. If you play Greed when you're at 8, you can go down to 2. You still get 3 cards out of it. You're not going to do that with Sylvan. You're going to get 1. And you're going to like anemically look at the top 3 cards of your library forever, wishing you could shuffle. Greed is just better overall, and I think, and you don't need the effect early on. With a Singleton copy, you don't get it that early on anyway. It's better to just have it in the deck for later.
Yeah, especially against control matchups when you're just playing kind of like some Battleship Magic, and you know you're deep in the game, and everyone's had a pretty high life total. You know, a lot of, like you said, a lot of the disenchants have already been burned on other things. War of Attrition. You draw Greed. You're just like, this is gas.
So insane. Yeah, you just put it out there, and the person just looks at it, and you can just tell.
they're not expecting it. They're like, I got no answers.
Totally reckon they're looking at 2 Divine Offerings in their hand or something too, or a Dust to Dust in their hand and a Divine Offering. I play Greed. What do you do, dude? So good. And then finally, this is the thing that sets my list off from apart from many, many, many other people who have played their own versions of this. A lot of people have used Hymn to Torak in the sideboard. I actually did have hymns in my sideboard, 3 of them in 2018, and I did not like them. Because what happens is when you play the control mirror, you hymn each other, and then you just go back to playing draw go again.
Yeah, you need something to actually close out the game, and Hypnotic Specter on a stick, that's a beat stick. You know, it flies, it attacks.
So gnarly.
You just go for it. It's one of my favorite creatures of all time.
Yeah, most people who have played from that era respect Hypnotic Specter. It's insane how good it is. When you look at it measured against every other creature, a lot of people say, I think Serenade Befried is probably the best overall creature in terms of utility in old school, but the most powerful creature in that format is easily Hypnotic Specter.
There have been so many times as a kid when I was playing just like kitchen table casual Magic. It's like turn 1, Swamp, Dark Ritual, Hypnotic Specter, pass. They kind of don't have anything. Turn 2, another Swamp, Hymn to Torak, attack with Hypnotic Specter, GGs. You just kind of mind twisted them.
Yeah, good times, right? Yeah, that was standard format in 1996. The Necro Summer, the famous Necro Summer after Ice Age came out. And suddenly these insanely disruptive evil mono black decks had the most powerful card drawing engine ever printed. Really ever printed. To this day. Necro is just, it's so insane, and it's legal in Commander, where you have 40 life points. How fun and fair is that?
Gotta jam a green in there too.
No, Necro's more than enough. I mean, they printed tons of crazy card advantage things, including like Tevish Sat, Planeswalker, which is ridiculous, but Necro is still the king. And getting back to the Hypnotic Specter. Oh yeah, one other thing about Necro too, just as an aside. I knew that something was up when shortly after Ice Age came out and people kind of figured it out, maybe 3 months after printing, and Necropotence was famously called the worst card in Ice Age by Scry Magazine, or Inquest Magazine. I think it was Inquest. They ranked all the cards in Ice Age, and they literally put Necro dead last.
Funny.
Yeah, who's making those decisions? Well, I knew something was up when people would challenge me with their standard decks, their Type 2 decks, against the deck, and I would lose.
Interesting.
I would lose to Type 2 mono black because they had 4 Necro and I couldn't deal with it.
Huh.
They would get Necro out and I'd just be dicking around with Jamity Tome. They're drawing like 6 cards a turn. And they're hemming me and strip mining my lands, mind twisting me, playing Specters and untargetable Knights and Discs. All that stuff was just horrible to deal with. And Necro just made it impossible to beat them. They resolved the Necro, I couldn't win. So I was looking around for something to sort of fill the Hymn to Torak slot. It just wasn't cutting it. And I went and I looked at this creature and I went, why am I not running Hypnotic Specters? They're not that hard to cast. More importantly, in the mirror match, your opponent removes all their creature kill. They see no creatures in the first game, and what's better against a Mishra's Factory? A Divine Offering or a Swords to Plowshares? Well, Divine Offering is better because Divine Offering also kills Jamity Tome and Chaos Orb and Moxes and Felwarstone. Whereas Swords to Plowshares has an insanely narrow range of application. So people take out Swords to Plowshares, they take out Abyss, they remove all the ways to kill creatures in their decks, usually except for Balance, and sometimes they even cut Balance. And you go turn 2 Specter, bro. Good luck, you have an orb in your deck before this thing kills you. It stops Library cold in its tracks. It flies over factories, they can't defend against them. And it's random discard every turn.
Exactly, I think the random discard is definitely not something to ignore.
No, it's quite the contrary. It's devastating. Devastating. Random discard is one of the most vicious things you can do to your opponent. And the Specter is damage and pressure and random discard every single turn, and it's relentless.
And their ground troops can't do anything.
They can't do anything except just get destroyed.
Goblins, Curative, nothing's touching it.
Nothing's touching it. And in all of my testing, when I played against control matches, either people, I would give them a control deck to play against me, or they'd have their own. No one could stop the Specters. They were impossible to deal with. There was no solution. Even if you kept 4 Plowshares in, you were still screwed by them, because I don't always draw Specters. And in a bunch of the games, you get these useless Plowshares in your hand instead of Disenchants and Divine Offerings. I'm like, well, I don't have a Specter this game, but I got a Jam-Day Tome, and you've got 3 swords. And guess what's going to happen? In 6 turns, I'm going to Mind Twist those 3 Plowshares out of your hand and then play a Specter.
Exactly.
Which is what would happen. It's so evil.
Yeah.
Because there's basically, this is sort of the classic threat versus answer paradox, that threats are better than answers usually for this reason, because there's 3 scenarios. I play a Specter and you have a Plowshares, and we're in parity. You got a small mana advantage. You traded 1 for 3. But in all the other situations where you have Swords to Plowshares and I don't draw Specter, that's my advantage.
It's a dead card.
It's a dead card in your hand. And you don't have the ability to deal with something else that's substantially more lethal, like a card draw spell. And then in all the situations where I have a Specter and you don't have a Swords, you're dead too.
It's they're losing turns, because not only are they losing 2 life, they're losing a draw. So it widens the gap.
Yeah.
They have to almost do like 1.5 turns just to be at parity with you.
Exactly. It's just, I'm favored in 2/3 of the situation. The best case scenario is that they have a Swords to Plowshares to kill my Specter before I get to hit them once with it. That's the best case scenario.
And you still gain 2 life.
Right. and it goes from that best case scenario down to like they die on the spot, which is often what happens in game 2. When you play the Specter and your opponent just goes, oh no.
They just scoop.
They just scoop. They take 2 hits from it, and they're like, they just discard 2 counter spells.
They just scoop.
And they're just done.
Yeah.
Like, you just feel so hopeless against it.
They don't even wait for the Specter to kill them outright.
Yeah. So I ran 4 Hypnotic Specters in the sideboard, and my God, are they good. And you guys will see that in the games that are coming up. So that concludes the deck tech. I know that it was long. I hope you enjoyed that and the storytelling. Sam, thank you so much for joining me.
This is great.
Wonderful conversation. And coming up soon on the agenda, we have the quarterfinals from 2019 Magic Fest Las Vegas Old School World Championship.
It's going to be great.
Stay tuned for those games. Can't wait to do the commentary. See you guys in a minute.